in the wisdom of men or women, but in the power of God. I always begin my scripture classes with the reading from 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 to 5. And the reason why I do this is because the sentiments that Paul expresses in these verses are the sentiments in my own heart, even as I begin this course. And what do I mean by sentiments? First, there is weakness and fear and trembling. Weakness and fear and trembling, not because I have not faced an audience before, not because I have not conducted classes online before, not because I have not prepared what I'm going to say to you, but weakness and trembling because during these days, we are not going to talk about an idea. We are not going to talk about a virtue. We are not going to talk about a quality. We are going to talk about a person. A person whom words are inadequate to describe. A person who, on the one hand, will be so powerful as to take a whip to the temple, overturn the tables of the money changers, and drive out those who were selling sheep and goats. And a person who will sweat what seems to be great drops of blood falling on the ground because he's so frightened. A person who could argue intellectually about taxes to Caesar and about the resurrection and about the great commandment and about David's son with the intellectuals of his time, and a person to whom children were drawn, who could take the children in his arms and bless them. And so the question is, how do we begin to speak about such a person? And someone has said, whereof we cannot speak, thereof we must remain silent. And I say, no, whereof we cannot speak, we must at least try to stammer. And so my speech and my proclamation, like Paul says in these verses, hopefully will be with a demonstration of the Spirit and of power. And that is why I would like, first of all, that when you read any single text in Scripture, you keep these two cautions, I would say, which the evangelist John gives. You keep these two cautions in your mind. And what are the cautions which John gives us in his gospel as to how we will read the Gospel of Mark? First, John says in chapter 20, now Jesus did many other signs, however, he says, which are not written in this book. So very clearly, what John is saying, that I have not written down everything I could write, very clearly. So in other words, some things I have written, so I have chosen these things which I want to write. You notice the first point. So in chapter 20, verses 30 to 31, this is the point that he is making, that out of the many things which John could write, he has chosen these which are now in his gospel. In the last chapter and the last verse, he is using what is known as hyperbolic language, once again reminding us that there are many other things which Jesus did which he has not written. So the point which the evangelist is making is this, that neither his gospel nor the other gospels nor everything that is written about Jesus will give us a clear picture about Jesus. No, and that is why I would say, for me, you notice, of the 5 words that you see on the screen, I have underlined one, because that is the word which is most important of all. And it is the word according. So it is the evangelion, it is the good news according to Mark, according to Luke, according to Matthew, according to John. This must be kept in mind. Let me give you an example of what I mean. Supposing I were to ask you, which is the prayer that Jesus taught his disciples? The larger majority would say, I could ask you in the chat just to confirm. And so let me ask you in the chat, and let me ask you to write in the chat, which is the prayer that Jesus taught his disciples? Write in the chat, write in the chat. Come on, those of you who can, quick. A few answers only we will have. Very good. Go ahead, go ahead, go ahead. I can see the answers are coming in. Yes, yes, very good, good, good. I got the idea, I got the idea, I got the idea. So you see, brothers, all those who wrote our Father, good. However, I want you, not now, you can go, believe me now when I say, go to the Gospel of Luke chapter 11, verses 2 to 4. And you'll find there that the disciples see Jesus praying in chapter 11, verse 1. Luke is the gospel of prayer because Jesus is shown praying many times. So in Luke 11:1, we are shown that Jesus is praying. And after he finishes praying, his disciples come to him and say, Lord, teach us to pray as John taught his disciples to pray. And Jesus says, when you pray, say, Father, not our. So there is no our in the Gospel of Luke. So what you are doing without knowing it, you are saying our Father in your answer. You are going to Matthew chapter 6, verses 7 to 13, which is part of Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus gives instructions to his disciples on 3 points of Jewish piety: almsgiving, prayer, and fasting. So it is in the context of his instructions on prayer that Jesus teaches them there, or doesn't really teach them. It is part of Matthew's Sermon on the Mount discourse. He says there, our Father. So the question is, brothers, why did you say our Father? Because Matthew's gospel, and this is one of the questions which I gave you, was known and is known as the Ecclesial Gospel. The Greek word ecclesia means those who are called out, ekkaleo. So those who are called out, those who are set apart, those who are meant to be a contrast community. This is the ecclesia. Matthew is the only evangelist who uses the word ecclesia in his gospel. That is translated in English as church. So Jesus is going to build the church on Peter the rock, and Jesus speaks about the church in the community discourse. So 3 times in his gospel, Matthew uses the word ecclesia or church. And so Matthew's gospel was known and is known as the Ecclesial Gospel, and in the early church was used more than others. And that's why, because it was read so constantly, the prayer that we recite at every Eucharist, which is actually the Lord's Prayer, was a prayer taken from the Gospel of Matthew and recited in the liturgy. That's why, without even thinking, you said, our Father. Now, next time I ask you a question like this, you must first say which gospel, because the answers in different gospels will be different. You might remember that I said to you that Jesus was anointed by a woman. And if I ask you, on which part of his body was Jesus anointed, you will sometimes say, because you've not been listening to what I'm saying, you would say the head, or you would say the feet, and you'll be wrong. You'll be wrong. Because if you say the head, I will say, no, I'm talking about the Gospel of Luke. In Luke, it is not the head which is anointed, it is the feet of Jesus which are anointed. In John, it is the feet of Jesus which are anointed. The head is anointed only in Matthew and Mark. So really, brothers, be aware that the next time I ask you a question, you must ensure that you listen to the question carefully and that you respond or answer, if you like, in an intellectual manner, because during these days, we are going to keep our hearts aside. Don't tell me what you're feeling. What you're feeling can be told to me after the class, but in the class, I want you to tell me what you're thinking, because during these days, we are going to bring our minds to study the gospel, namely according to Mark. So, like John, Mark could also say, these are some of the things which Jesus said and did, which I have put in my gospel, and I have put them in this way. So through my words and through my method, you must come out with who Jesus is for you. And this is what I hope to be able to do with you as we go along. And so the gospel, according to Mark, is made up of, notice, 16 chapters. And please note this, and I'll tell you why I'm doing that later. I am ending the gospel at chapter 16, verse 8. Now, if you go through your versions, and I hope that all of you have the NRSV, those of you who do not have the parallels, the gospel parallels, I would suggest you please go to Google and try to see where you can get a free parallel to download. If you're in a seminary, the seminary will surely have one in the library. It's called the Gospel Parallels, and I'll talk about that later. But please try to get that book, because I will also be referring to that book as we go along. You can see there are free downloads also. You can download it on your computer and keep it there if you have a computer, or on your phone. So please see, Mark chapter 1, verse 1, up to chapter 16, verse 8. If you go through your Bibles and you look at Mark and look at the end, you'll find that there are two other endings mentioned there. One is known as a shorter ending, and one is known as a longer ending. You notice? Even the RSV or the new RSV, no matter which version, has put those after chapter 16, verse 8. So already, the new RSV, the RSV, is giving you their stand. And I would say 99% of the scholars believe that the Gospel of Mark ends in chapter 16, verse 8, and does not continue till verse 20. Verses 9 to 20 are a much, much later addition. And I hold that the Gospel of Mark ends in chapter 16, verse 8, and I'll tell you my reasons when we come to the end of the Gospel. Now, brothers, sisters, if you are in your own hometown, then it may not be possible for you to even get these books. Online, there are a few books which might be available free of charge, but many of these books which you see now are basically standard books which might not be available in the regular manner for you to download free of charge. And so therefore, I'm suggesting these to you, and you can see them if it is possible for you to get them. If you are in a seminary, then you can go through at least one or two of these books, which will be very helpful for you. They are heavy, they can be heavy, and I'll tell you which is lighter. But if you can go through them, it'll be helpful for you. Gundry is a very, very good author and regarded over the world as an excellent author, especially on the Gospel of Mark. So if you go through his book, it's not as difficult to read. Gulick is the author who wrote for the Word Biblical Commentary. WBC that you see stands for Word Biblical Commentary, and the Word Biblical Commentary is a standard commentary. Whenever they ask a scholar to write for them, that scholar has to follow the format. So the best part about Word Biblical Commentary is this, that no matter which book you're referring to, whether Matthew, whether Luke, whether John, it'll be in the same format. So if you're a person who's systematic and wants a particular format, you can get that format in these commentaries like Hermenia, Anchor Bible Series, Word Biblical Commentary. These are standard commentaries. So Gulick has written, notice, only up to chapter 8, verse 26. Now, you might say, what is special about chapter 8, verse 26? Because most scholars today, and we will see that in the structure, most scholars today believe that the watershed of Mark's gospel is in chapter 8, verses 27 to 30. What does watershed of Mark's gospel in chapter 8, verses 27 to 30 mean? It means that everything up to chapter 8, verse 26 is leading to 8:27 to 30, and everything takes off from 8:27 to 30. So 8:27 to 30 is like the gathering point. It gathers everything which has come from chapter 1, verse 1 to 8:26, and then it pushes it forward. So that's why even when scholars are writing commentaries, if they were writing about Mark, they would write the first half and the second half. So up to chapter 8, verse 26 is written by Gulick. He died a little while after writing this commentary, and his work was continued by Evans. But if you notice in the next slide, you will see Evans writes in the similar manner to Robert Gulick, because he's also writing for Word Biblical Commentary. This is a very, very detailed commentary for those of you who want to meet. The third book, Robert Funk, was an author who had a seminar. And in this seminar, they had voting at the end of their discussions. They had voting. And according to this pebbles, which each one was given a pebble, which they had to put, they took every single verse of the parables of Jesus was taken, and then they had a dialogue about this, they had a discussion about this, and then what they did was they had voting at the end. And the voting was done in this manner. Those of you who believe that this particular word is from the mouth of Jesus, put a red pebble. So they put a red pebble. Supposing you think that this word is from the evangelist, then put a blue pebble. They put a blue pebble. And this word is much, much later added after the gospel written, put a green pebble. And that's what they did. They put a green pebble. So in this way of voting, what they did was they were able to find out. So if you go through this book by Robert W. Funk, you will notice that in the book they give you these words are exactly from Jesus. These are by the evangelist, and these are put later in tradition. So that is a good book for you to know what Jesus would have said, and to see also how study is done. Adela Yabo Collins is a female author, and she writes well also. She also writes, for example, in the Gospel of Mark, and she writes for Hermenia also. So she has also written for Hermenia, good author. Yersel's book is an extremely beautiful book. It is in paperback edition if I'm not mistaken, it is just about 290 pages or 300 pages, and it's a very, very easy to read book. Notice it is actually what is known as reader response criticism. That was a criticism which took a lot of root a few years ago, and his book is called Reading Mark, Reader Response Criticism. Very, very easy to read, and I've taken some of my structures from Yersel because I find his structures very, very good. So Van Yersel is basically a Dutch author, and you can read that book also. Marcus is another author who really is giving detailed commentaries on the Gospel of Mark. This is not the commentary, basically, it's an exegesis of the Old Testament in the Gospel of Mark, but Marcus also has a commentary on the Gospel of Mark. So if you go to Marcus, you'll find very, very detailed. Evans, you remember, I mentioned earlier about Evans, that he continued the work which Gulick began. If you notice, this is the series volume 34B. Robert Gulick wrote volume 34A. And so this is basically the one of Evans. Rhodes and Mickey are also scholars who write about Mark as story, and it's a good book. As I will speak about Mark as story myself, I will make a reference to this. And Reed was the first in 1901 who wrote about the messianic secret. It was because of Reed that people began to look at Mark in a totally different way. And so, brothers, sisters, I want to begin very briefly today by giving you 10, I could give you many more, but I'm giving you 10 characteristics of the Gospel of Mark. I want you to keep most of these in mind when you are reading any text in the Gospel of Mark. I have chosen these characteristics of the Gospel of Mark because in a summary form, I would like to believe that they are giving you what the Gospel of Mark is about, and they are pointing you to how you can read the Gospel of Mark. The first, which is a general characteristic, not only is Mark's Gospel the shortest in the number of chapters. For example, Mark has 16 chapters, John has 21 chapters, Matthew has 28 chapters, and Luke has 24. Now, even though Luke has 24 chapters and Matthew 28, you notice Luke's Gospel is the longest of all. As a matter of fact, Luke's Gospel is even longer than his second work, which is the Acts of the Apostles. Here in brackets, that is 678, 1071, 1151, and 879 refer to the verses in each of these Gospels. So you can see very clearly that Mark, with 678 verses, is the shortest of the four Gospels. Now, this is a very, very, very important point to keep in mind, because it will indicate to you, it will really indicate to you that Mark does not mince words at all. And really, you will get the idea that Mark is telling it like it is, that Mark is saying it as it happened, and you can get this Jesus who is so strong and so weak. You can get the same, this Jesus who's totally, completely human. And that's why Mark will have no problem whatever with telling us that it was John the Baptizer who baptized Jesus. When we come to Matthew and Luke, and I've given you the references so you can see the differences there, I will point out how Matthew and Luke are different and what it means that Mark has said that Jesus was baptized by John. In Mark, we do not have the three temptations. So therefore, there is no dialogue between Jesus and Satan in the temptation in the desert. Mark, Matthew, and Luke have the three temptations. Now, once again, if I ask you, what is the order of the three temptations? It is very likely you will say stones into bread, the pinnacle of the temple, and the kingdoms of this world, and you will be wrong. Because you have not asked the basic question, namely, which gospel? So, when we look at the temptations in the Gospel of Matthew, it is stones into bread. Jesus is taken to the pinnacle of the temple and asked to throw himself down because he would be taken in the angel's arms and shown the kingdom of the world if he will bow down and worship Satan in the Gospel of Matthew. Luke's Gospel, Luke chapter 4, verses 1 to 13, has stone into bread, not stones, but stone into bread. Jesus, the second temptation, is shown the kingdoms of the world, and only in the third temptation is Jesus taken to the pinnacle of the temple. And the reason why this is the third temptation in the Gospel of Luke is because for Luke, the temple is the climax. Luke's Gospel begins with Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, offering sacrifice in the temple where he is told about the birth of his son. And Luke's Gospel ends in chapter 24, verse 53 by telling us that the disciples were in the temple praising and glorifying God. Jesus does not really have too much of an issue with the temple. As a matter of fact, if you look at what we call not so much the cleansing, but I would say clearing of the temple. It is the clearing of the temple. In Luke, it is very, very, very mild. Luke narrates the clearing in only 2 verses in his gospel. So Jesus is very friendly with the temple. In the Gospel of Luke, the temple is the climax, and that is why in Luke, the third temptation is Jesus is taken to the pinnacle of the temple and asked to throw himself down. So this gives you an idea of how to read. However, in Mark, there is no dialogue between Jesus and Satan at all. Jesus, notice, Mark narrates the temptation, and we shall see that in detail later. He narrates it in 2 verses. The Spirit drove Jesus into the wilderness, and he is tempted by Satan there, but there is no dialogue. This statement which Jesus makes, which is a powerful and a strong statement which shows the power of his word, is that the Sabbath was made for humans and not humans for the Sabbath. Is only found in the Gospel of Mark. And even though Matthew and Luke have taken a great deal from the Gospel of Mark, this statement has not been taken either by Matthew or by Luke because it seems so powerful, so strong. In the Gospel of Mark, the family of Jesus is not shown in a positive light. The family of Jesus are told that he has gone mad. He has gone out of his mind. And so they come to restrain him. So in the Gospel of Mark, the family of Jesus do not come out as strongly as in the other Gospels, especially in the Gospel of Luke. Only in Mark and in his hometown is Jesus referred to as Son of Mary. Now, there are a variety of explanations as to why Jesus is called Son of Mary, and one of them is this, that his father, or rather his foster father Joseph, had probably died some time ago, and so therefore he was known for quite some time now as Son of Mary. But when we read the context of this, it seems to me, and it seems quite clear to me, that Son of Mary here is used as an insult. Son of Mary the people are saying, we know he's the son of Mary, we know his mother, but we don't know his father. We don't know where his father is. We don't know where his father comes from. And when we come to the context, this is what I will speak about. But here, only in the Gospel of Mark. And so, because this seems to be a very strong insult, Matthew has omitted it. Matthew has a very, very similar scene in his Gospel, Matthew 13, verses 54 to 58. Compare it with Mark chapter 6, verses 1 to 6, and you will see the changes Matthew has made. Matthew does not call Jesus there the carpenter. He calls Jesus in his gospel the carpenter's son. So therefore, Matthew is speaking about his father. Mark will say, is not this the carpenter? Jesus took on the same trade of his father, and that Jesus was a carpenter is known by us from the Gospel of Mark. But Matthew's Gospel speaks about Jesus as the carpenter's son. Mark will say, it's not this the carpenter, the son of Mary. So for me, it's an insult. So only in Mark, among the synoptics, John's Gospel has in chapter 9 of the Gospel of John a miracle in which Jesus puts paste on the man's eyes and asks him to wash in the pool of Siloam. But I'm talking about the synoptics. Only in Mark, among the synoptics, does Jesus use external methods twice. Once is when there is a deaf man with an impediment in his speech, and he is brought to Jesus. Jesus uses spittle and mud to put on his ears and eyes. And the second one is the healing of the blind man in two stages in Mark 8, 22 to 26, which concludes or completes, as you can see, the first part of the Gospel of Mark. Why Jesus does this, we shall see when we come to those texts. Brothers and sisters, this parable is an extremely beautiful parable. The seed growing secretly. I prefer this term, the seed growing secretly. Some call it the growing seed, but I prefer seed growing secretly, is found only in the Gospel of Mark, and I believe it gives us a lesson for life. The total abandonment of Jesus is portrayed vividly by Mark. In other words, in chapter 14, verses 51 and 52, Mark will tell us about a young man who's coming out at the time when Jesus is being arrested. And this young man has a loincloth. And Mark will tell us that the young man saw, he possibly got so frightened that he left the loincloth and ran away naked. This is Mark's way of portraying, of showing the total abandonment of Jesus by his disciples. And finally, Mark uses the sandwich construction often in his gospel. In the next lecture, I will tell you what the sandwich construction is, give you examples about the sandwich construction, and ask you to do some homework on the sandwich construction.